Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with Dr. Joe Miller. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you are the co-founder of the Center for Cultural Apologetics.
Yes.
And we're going to be talking about a topic that maybe people aren't too familiar with, but it's culturally relevant, and that is the topic of eugenics. So first, what is eugenics?
Yeah, it's a word that not a lot of people know, but a lot of the parts of it are still active today. So eugenics was a word coined by a guy named Francis Galton back in the late 1800s, late 1900s. And he was a cousin with Charles Darwin, and he sort of took Darwin's ideas and said, hey, if we take what's happening in nature, nature's kind of selecting which creatures are more fit to survive, and we sort of put science to this, could we help advance the evolution of society, of humans, through taking direct scientific action? So at its core, it's that idea, and it just sort of means good breeding. How do we breed better human beings?
Yeah, so it's like a human ordained, I guess, evolution.
Yeah. So eugenics, you can look at, there's really two classical kind of groups. There's positive eugenics, which is people saying, hey, I make good choices about who I'm going to marry, because I want them to be biologically compatible or produce really tall people or whatever your goal would be. Healthy, if you don't want to marry somebody who's not healthy. So that's sort of called positive because you choose to do those things. Negative eugenics was forced things like forced sterilizations because, this group of people is sick and they don't want them to pass on their genes, so the government would force them to be sterilized against their will. And then there's sort of what I would call natural eugenics, just sort of the way nature operates was the idea within that Darwin's framework of the purely natural material world. Fitter stuff survives, less fit stuff dies.
Right. So I think people might be familiar with the negative eugenics, which was something that was a part of World War II,
yes.
But also even modern day negative eugenics with sterilizing women. So that's something that people are probably familiar with. How do we see it play, what are some other specific roles that eugenics plays in our current cultural climate?
Yeah, you're right to point out, with Hitler and the eugenic thing, man, once that really came out, even the people that were pro-eugenists said, okay, that's something we can't
get behind,
yeah. Or at least not publicly, because privately what they said is we need to kind of have the softer, gentler way of promoting good breeding. So you see a transition in the literature in the 60s that really talked about people choosing, we want to convince people it's their choice to live this lifestyle, it's their choice to be good breeders in their decision-making process. And so you see there's an effort to convince people to participate in these eugenic type goals for their life.
So how do we see that eugenics play a role specifically as it relates to AI?
Yeah. Well, AI is, artificial intelligence, which most people are familiar with. Yeah. And there's a couple levels of AI. So if you're talking about, on my Tesla, that my car can drive and stay within the lines, that's a form of artificial intelligence that's just basic decision making of keeping the car within the lanes, right? But then there's more advanced artificial intelligence, which is the idea of can we replicate human consciousness or even someday put our consciousness inside of an artificial computer system. And so there's a whole spectrum of what we mean by that, depending on who's doing the studies there, from the car to replacing humanity.
Right. Yeah, and so that becomes then this kind of predicament that we need to grapple with. So from a Christian perspective, how would you respond to such a predicament?
Yeah, I think the part to be careful of for Christians is, okay, it's one thing if my car can stay in the lines. Right. It's another thing if we're saying, hey, we can build a better human, which is essentially a eugenic idea, right? So, well, what happens when we maybe equip certain humans to have certain skills or capacities because they have technology integrated? You see this in sci-fi movies, right? If you're a sci-fi movie fan, you love this sort of thing, like somebody's got super arms or their mind works in a great way. Well, is there potential that the wealthy will be able to get access to this and then the poor will be left behind? Or will we start to value some humans more than others because they're artificially enhanced? And again, I think it's where, even as a Christian watching sci-fi films, this plays out all the time, and it does because we see it historically played out that way in the old eugenics fashion, and so there's no reason to think humans will be much different today in acting on those compulsions.
Right. And so then for those who have a Christian perspective, how do they kind of engage in conversations when talking about AI and kind of the excitement of it, the potential of it, but also some deep concerns specifically as it relates to humans and how humans are valued?
Yeah. I think one of the things they could do is an easy sort of bellwether is to look at and say, okay, whatever kind of AI you're talking about, however you want to define it, you know, instead of getting caught in the nitty gritty, which most people aren't aware of, just say, look, ask people, is this going to be something that is going to benefit everybody or only a segment of people? And if it's always going to be restricted to some sort of tribalistic group, you know, oh, it's only for these politically connected people, it's only for the wealthy, it's only for this, you know, racial group, or it's only for this men, or if it's only for women, or however it is, if it starts to become tribalistic technology, where some humans are excluded, then that's where I think we have to start saying, okay, little red flags have to come up, because that's not valuing the sacredness of every human being if that technology becomes exclusive to one group or another.
Right. So let's talk very briefly then about kind of that sacredness, a basic understanding of where we get our sacredness from and how that would be communicated to someone maybe who's skeptical and saying, no, let's not stop advances in science, let's go for it. Like, how would you have that conversation and kind of show the basis for human sacredness?
Yeah. So if everybody reads like anybody who talks about this issue, especially from a secular perspective, it's always based on the idea of human dignity and human rights. But read enough in that stuff, and most people admit, those are all pretty squishy words. They don't have a lot of concrete meaning. What you think is somebody who deserves dignity or rights is different than somebody else. So how do you decide? Well, the scripture gives us a better playing field to have that. In Genesis 1:27, I even get to wear the shirt, B'Tselem Elohim, it's Genesis 1:27. It just means in the image of God. And so this idea that all of us are created as sacred beings in the image of God, regardless of our social status, if we're the in crowd or the out crowd, financial status, rich or poor, regardless of whatever social constructs people create to segregate us, we're all sacred. And if we start with that beginning place, not on discussions of rights, not on discussions of like human dignity, but on the actual of our base nature that is sacred, regardless of whether we're handicapped or fully abled, whatever the terms are, then I think we're going to end up talking about a better path forward.
Right. Thank you. If you would like more on this topic, go to morethancake.org and you'll find Joe Miller's blogs there.